how many of you remember September the 9th, 1970? And with a gentleman who will never forget that time, Graham Dobson. Graham was called out to the lifeboat, the Matthew Simpson, and it turned out, I think, Graham, to be a journey, an adventure that you'll never forget.
Quite unbelievable. Quite unbelievable. Never seen the sea so rough. Never been on a sea as rough in my life. And we got a call at 6 o'clock in the morning from the Honorary Secretary, Mr. Remington, saying a boat had possibly sunk 5 miles north of the Chicken's Rock. So within a few minutes we turned up at the Lifeboat station, and usual people were getting dressed and all the usual jobs done. Within 5-6 minutes we're in the water, proceeding across Port Eden Bay. But the wind was south, so the bay was relatively calm, but just a swell. But the one thing the coxswain said to me when we were going around the old breakwater, just look at that sky. He said, it's full of menace. And he said, when we get outside this calm shelter of the cliffs down towards the sound, he said, we're going to cop it. And cop it we did.
Now the coxswain was Dennis Madrill, a man of solid.
He was 30 years the coxswain in the lifeboat eventually, yes.
And you'd trust him with your life, wouldn't you?
Oh yes, he was a very experienced man. He'd been out in all weathers, and more of that later, but he was the right man for the job on the day. And of course he had a great responsibility, not only just for us to rescue somebody, he had a responsibility to keep his crew safe when they were working the boat. And as it turned out, sometimes he was having kittens that day because of the state of the sea.
Now who else was on board?
There was the second coxswain, was Peter Woodworth, who lived at Dandy Hill. There was Duncan Crageen, he was the youngest member. He came with us because Norman Sansbury, one of the regular crew members, was in Scotland getting a new fishing boat. It was Billy Crageen, he was the second mechanic under me, and the radio operator. Ernest Chimman, fisherman. Herbert Creppen, fisherman.
So how did
Dennis
you get
Madrill, the coxswain.
So how did you get to know the lifeboat needed you?
A phone call from the Honorary Secretary. They were informed by the Wigtown Coast Guard. It used to be through these coastal radio stations, Port Patrick Radio, so I presume the Coast Guard learnt of a Mayday, obviously through the coastal radio stations probably. So that's how we ended up at sea that day.
How did you hear the news? Were you at home when the phone went?
I was at home. I was
in
bed,
would it be?
6 o'clock in the morning.
Aye.
And when the phone rings in the lifeboat house at 6 o'clock in the morning, it's not someone to tell you that you've won the pools.
I'm smiling because you know almost as soon as it went that you had to be going somewhere to save a life or two.
Oh yes, oh yes.
What did you know about what you were going to see ahead of you relating to the vessel that was in trouble? Did you know anything about
No,
it?
knew nothing about the vessel, except it was a small coaster, and it was en route to Northern Ireland. So the hows and the wheres and wherefores of how the boat came to be there and all only came out afterwards, because we were not privy to that information. Only the shipping people had that information.
And I suppose Dennis, as coxswain in charge, was spot on with the weather, was he?
Well, he was more than spot on. When we eventually got a couple of miles offshore, we then came out of the shelter of the land, because the cliffs kept us sheltered all the way out. But then we met the sound tide, and all you could say, Alan, that it was like getting on a roller coaster, and a bad one at that. And sometimes the rails of the lifeboat, they were completely underwater on one side. It was tilted over that far. It was quite alarming, but then we started to ship large amounts of water over the stern and fill the cabin up at the back. Well, which wasn't unknown. We've had that before when we've been out on exercise in a very, very strong wind. But this day it was something different. You could smell a lot of trouble somehow. So after a while the coxswain said it was too dangerous to proceed as we were. So we put out the large drogue at the back, which is that's a technical term, but it's a sea anchor. Ours was a big canvas one on ropes, and we towed that behind to steady the boat up and stop, hopefully, the sea coming over the stern.
Did it?
Because the coxswain, yes, it steadied the boat to a large extent, but when you were getting propelled with the waves going under you, it was like being on a surfboard, and the boat was banging. When you were falling off a wave, it was like dropping the boat on the road. There was so much banging, and it was unbelievably rough.
What was visibility like? It'd be 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock, dawn would be up, September. Sea mist about, or?
Rain, very heavy rain, and the wind was south, and visibility would have been a couple of miles, maybe. It was hard to say because there was spray flying everywhere, etc., etc. So you couldn't have told to within a certain distance, but you had visibility. It wasn't fog or anything like
And do members of the crew, are they stationed at certain points on the lifeboat, ready for action?
usually, but on that day we were all in the rear cabin because the coxswain stood on a platform to operate the controls. He was exposed to the elements entirely, virtually, and he copped it in the face all the time, when we were taking heavy seas. But we proceeded for some time after the sea anchor was deployed, and to say the least, it was getting a bit hairy. But then a plane flew over, and it was a Shackleton from RAF Valley in Anglesey, and they got in touch with us, and then they sighted a life raft several miles to the north of us. So we proceeded at a snail's pace, obviously, and came up with this life raft, and lo and behold, the canopy was on it, it was intact, and there was nobody in it.
What was the feeling on board?
Well,
On board the lifeboat,
disappointment.
once you suddenly see the life raft has got nobody on it, where in heaven's name is the vessel?
Well, the answer came back a few minutes later. We were asked to get the life raft on board the boat by the Coast Guard because it contained a number which would have identified the life raft and to which ship it belonged. Because it could have obviously been, for obvious reasons, washed off a ship in conditions like that and belonged to somebody else. So this thing was brought alongside, and you could imagine there were 5 of us. The second coxswain led the deck party. There were 5 of us on the deck, and this thing had to be hauled over the side, and all you could describe it was like something out of It's a Knockout on the television. This thing was rearing up with a wind that was force 10. The sea was waist deep on the deck, and the coxswain was having kittens, hoping we wouldn't all get washed off. So we got this thing partly over, and fortunately we had 2 very large sheath knives in a forward cuddy where we kept ropes. So we took those and stabbed this goddamn life raft to death, virtually. It had to be deflated quickly, otherwise we possibly could have all been washed away. So,
And can I ask, were you able to practice this kind of exercise any time before actually doing it for real?
well, we've been out in rough weather, and we had problems one day at the back of the calf. One day we put an anchor down and got it stuck, and it was pretty rough that day, but there was nothing like it. It was a one-off, there's no doubt about it. Everybody said it was a one-off.
Now, when you were bringing on board this life raft, whereabouts were you? Were you past the calf at this stage?
Oh yes, we were about.
You're well out?
We were about 5-6 miles, maybe more, north of the chickens. Yes. And once we got this thing down, there was a name, there was a tag on it, which I think was removed and given to the radio operator, who then gave it to the Coast Guard, who instantly said, yes, it's the right one. So this life raft had to be rolled up and strapped to the rails because it was a material part of evidence for the sinking of the boat. So that was done, and we proceeded again. The plane was still flying, and there was a very large naval auxiliary vessel in the vicinity, and he'd stopped. I heard him talking to somebody else. He'd stopped his men going on the deck. It was too dangerous. So we proceeded again, and the coxswain at this time was getting pretty exhausted because he was fighting the wheel all the time, and his hands had become red with the movement of the wheel through his hands, and he was starting to get badly blistered. So he came down below, and the second coxswain took the wheel. So at this time it started to brighten up a little bit, and the wind was just as strong and the sea was just as bad. I mean, we were taking waves right over the lifeboat. She was submerging.
And how long have you been out at sea now, at this stage?
Around about 5-6 hours.
Really?
You know. Oh yes, we'd been 5.5 anyway, you know.
And you still couldn't find where you were going? What were you doing patrolling?
We were looking to see if there was another life raft, because they thought there could be. There were two on it. They knew, the Coast Guards, but they didn't know what had happened to the other. So whether it had gone down with the boat. So we proceeded, and then all of a sudden, the second coxswain, I was standing up with him, and he said, "I can see a life raft." And there in the distance was a life raft, the same as the other life raft, with no canopy on it, and two men sat in it, both in, what should we say, trousers, jeans or trousers, with vests on, in all that weather. And they of course couldn't see us, but the alarming thing was, when they did see us, they wanted to get out of their predicament darn quick. I remember that at this stage still the sea was coming onto the deck, you know, to the depth of a couple of feet. So we organised a deck party, the second coxswain organised that, put the scrambling nets over the side that are there for people who want to get a foothold on the lifeboat. So he went over the side, and the coxswain manoeuvred alongside very gingerly, and all this took some time, believe you me. And
this was in treacherous weather.
Oh, it was absolutely appalling, you know.
Were you scared?
No, not particularly. You're there to do a job. The thing was to get these fellas out of the predicament they were in, and they wanted to get out, but it could have ended up in a tragedy, because we were leaning over the side, 4 of us and the second coxswain on the outside, and the two rescued people which wanted to get on the boat, and they weren't in a fit state, if you understand, to help themselves. So eventually we grabbed them. They were just grabbed and unceremoniously upended on the deck in the mud, the water and all the rest, and they were unceremoniously dragged down the side of the lifeboat into the cabin.
Now the vessel they were on was SS Moonlight.
Yeah.
What did we know about that?
It belonged to the Glenlight Shipping Company. I'm not familiar with the thing. That's the company who owned it, and it was carrying salt, and it was going from Liverpool or wherever. I think it was Liverpool, to Northern Ireland, and this, of course, the salt shifted in the treacherous seas, and I'm afraid the rest was history. As soon as the salt shifted, yeah.
So these men were very fortunate to even get off the vessel.
Well, they were very lucky, and they told us straight away. They said, Luke, the other fellows have been washed away. They were washed away and drowned. They told us they were. They didn't get into the life raft. That was the other life raft they possibly could have got into. But how the canopy got detached on their one, they didn't know. They were in such a state of shock. I'm sure their memories would have been tainted, you know.
So just try, not easy, try to just pinpoint perhaps where you were out in the Irish Sea, fighting the weather and the elements and getting these lads on board. Whereabouts would you be?
We'd have been probably about 6 or 7, maybe more miles north of the Chicken's Rock. When we started to come in, because we went back to Port Erin, I can't remember, it must have taken us virtually a couple of hours to get in, because the weather was so bad.
You'd be against the wind then?
Yes, we were coming into the wind and the sea, but I think the tide had moderated a bit, and you know, it was still pretty bad. But how the two fellas survived, God only knows. They had luck on their side that day. But when we got into Port Erin, of course, you've seen the pictures, I think, Alan. There were hundreds of people waiting. This was before the days of mobile phones and the likes. So the grapevine worked pretty well. So anyway, the medicals came and examined these people, and they were suffering from severe shock, one of the doctors said, who came down. And they were hawked off immediately to hospital and kept in. And there wasn't much more to say about that. The life raft went to the Coast Guard people, and we put the boat back in the lifeboat house. But there was a little tale at the end of it. We put the boat in the lifeboat house because we were still sheltered there. And we got the boat in, and myself and the coxswain examined it to see if there was any damage. The boys were all anxious to get to the bay to have a pint after it all. And when we came to look round the boat, we couldn't see anything, so the boat was washed down, and me and the coxswain were last to leave. And on the way out, he poked me in the chest, and he said to me, "You, mister," he said, "will never ever go to sea on a rougher day than that if you live to be 100.
And that's something coming
and
from
I
Dennis.
said to him, "Well, it must have been bad." He said, "We don't want another one like that." And he was eventually 30 years in the job, and I don't doubt what he said. I couldn't judge it against anything because I was only a seagoing mechanic. I was not a fisherman. But the lucky bit came in the next day. We were down, myself and the coxswain, tidying up the paperwork, and I'd fueled the boat up just after we came in anyway. But he said to me, "Did we get any leaks?" So I said to him, "How do you mean?" He said, "Have you had the plugs out of the seven watertight compartments?" I said, "No, we'll take them out now." So we checked them all, and they were bone dry, you see. We came to the last one, took the plug out, and I was underneath, and I got drowned. And he says, "Good God," and it wasn't water, it was diesel. And I said to him, "Good God," I said, "we've ruptured a tank." So we had a huge tray there, massive tray, it held about 50 gallons. So we put this under, and eventually we caught all the fuel because it would have gone into the bay, you see. So anyway, he immediately gets on the phone, and we had fleet mechanics then who came over when we had a big problem, and this was a big problem because the fuel tanks were below the deck.
Was that affecting the way the lifeboat was behaving?
No, it didn't affect it at all, but it would obviously affect you if you had a leak. So anyway, the next day, Mr. Fred Beardmore, he was one of the senior fleet mechanics. He was a really spot-on chap. He came along. We had to remove the whole deck. It was a big job to get at the fuel tanks. The deck had to be taken up. So we hawked these fuel tanks out. They were drained, and we hawked them out to put them in a pressure test. And Fred said, "I can't understand how you got a leak because these tanks can't move." So when I saw exactly how they were fitted, they were hooped and they were put in place. You couldn't actually move them. And yet on that day, Alan, they had sustained damage with the rough weather.
Was Dennis right about his prophecy that you'll never go out?
Well, I have never been out and in a day like that. The only time the following lifeboat that took over, the Osman Gabriel, there was one call out they had, and I remember the second coxswain, Mr. Woodworth, saying when he became coxswain, he said he went out, they ran a part out, I think, to a ship, was stranded off the Calf, something like that, and they went out, and he said that was the nearest he came to the day we were out to the Moonlight, and that was the end of it. But the problem was, as Mr. Beardmore said when we took the tanks out, "It's a bloody good job you didn't run out of fuel, out there." Well, it crosses your mind, doesn't it? Makes you wonder. Luck on your side, you see.
Graham, that's a fascinating story from start to finish. Thank you for sharing it with us.
Right, thank you, Alan.
Graham Dobson on the rescuing of a couple of seamen on SS Moonlight, mentioning many of the crew there that were part and parcel of that particular rescue, the Matthew Simpson, the 9th of September 1970.